I'm Mark Oppenheimer. I'm the director of the Yale Journalism Initiative, and we're delighted to sponsor this event along with the Office of Sustainability of Yale University. Holly Parker and Erin Sturgis-Pascal and I have, I was about to say we've worked hard, but we actually haven't worked terribly hard. We've worked sufficiently hard to bring together two people who are remarkable presences in the debates about parking, traffic, sustainability, the environment, and so forth. Donald Shoup is going to speak first, and then we're going to go right into Tom Vanderbilt's presentation, and we'd ask that you reserve all of your comments and questions for the end. And they've both been incredibly gracious in suggesting that we allow ample time for comments and questions at the end. As a prefatory matter, let me just say that one always wonders when putting together an event at Yale College, what's the demand for this event? And how small a room would it have to be so that it seems crowded? And I'm just delighted to say that we guessed right, and that in fact there is the real curiosity about the questions that they ask and about the research that they do. And Donald Shoup, who's a graduate of Yale College and also got his doctorate in economics here, has since taught at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor and also at University of California at Los Angeles, where for some time now he's been a professor. As many of you probably know, he's the author of The High Cost of Free Parking. And perhaps most prestigiously, he has been referred to by no less an authority than the Wall Street Journal as a parking rock star, which I think he's the only parking rock star in the room anyway. And he will be followed by Tom Vanderbilt, who is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin and is a longtime freelance journalist for publications like the New York Times Magazine, Slate, Wired, and even the late lamented Gourmet. He is the author of Traffic, which has won him the status of, I believe he's been called a traffic guru. And so along with the parking rock star, we have the traffic guru. And between the two of them, we think they're going to present a very exciting evening of discussion of traffic, parking, and our green future. So please make sure that your mobile phones are off, or at least set to some sort of very quiet setting. And please join me in welcoming first Professor Donald Shoup.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak to you tonight. It's an honor to be here, speaking in a classroom while I can remember being a student. And for those of you who are students or can remember their days as students, I think you may have figured out that college professors come in two types. I don't mean the men and the women or the liberals and the conservatives. I mean the dogs and the cats. The dogs run around in packs. They bark a lot, and each one tries to become the top dog. But the cats are solitary. They like to mark territory as their own so that other cats will stay out. And among professors of transportation planning, the dogs chase after moving cars, or they ride around in cars with their heads hanging out the windows, excited by speed. But cats do not like riding around in cars, so they never hang their heads out the window. Cats instead inspect all of the parked cars, and they mark the tires. They also enjoy sleeping on the hood of a newly parked car where the engine is still warm. And cars are parked 95% of the time. So while dogs chase after the cars during the 5% of the time that they're moving, I thought I could learn something about the 95% of the time that cars are parked. So Tom Vanderbilt and I have divided it up. He gets the 5% of the time that cars are moving, and I get the other 95% of the time. And I think that parking is very important for many reasons. Say, in a group this large, several of you were probably even conceived in a parked car. I was surprised to learn that I had been called a parking rock star, which is of course not a real rock star, but I'm thinking of changing my name to Shoot Dog. Well, it's also an honor for somebody from California, especially Los Angeles, to be asked to talk about transportation planning in Connecticut or New England, because here's the view that most Easterners seem to have of California. And it is true that we've paved a lot over with parking lots. And Easterners think that we've even chopped down all the redwood trees to build gas stations. There are some. But I think, like California, too much of urban America looks like this picture of Silicon Valley. There's a light rail line in the lower right-hand corner of this picture, but you couldn't call it transit-oriented development. And we tend to ignore this asphalt blight in our life, especially when we're parked free in it, as all of these cars are at 2 o'clock on a weekday afternoon. But parking is free to us only in our role as motorists, of course. Just because we don't pay for parking doesn't mean the costs cease to exist. We pay for all this parking dearly in every other aspect of our life, as a homeowner, as an employee, as a taxpayer, as a citizen. But Silicon Valley and California are not the only places where parking dominates the landscape. Here's a picture of New Haven. There's a lot of parking in that. Let me see, I think I have 2 pictures of New Haven. Let's see, here's one. Yes, where is this? I think you can see the Temple Street garage in the picture, and the connector, which was built when I was a student, which really seems to be more of a divider. Here's another view of the part of the city. There's an awful lot of parking in New Haven. And if more parking were the solution to urban problems, New Haven would be a very prosperous city. Here's a parking garage that was built when I was a student. It's quite a wonderful piece of sculpture, and it works very well as a garage. But I don't think we should tell ourselves that more parking is going to solve many of our problems. It was built, of course, as part of an urban renewal project. Large parts of New Haven were torn down to provide the space for this. And the shopping center that I can remember being built has already been torn down right next to this parking structure. So I think I'd like to start with some background. I think for both Tom's and my talk is that our automobiles by themselves consume 1/8 of the world's oil supply every day. And we import 2/3 of this oil. We're paying for it with borrowed money. We have more vehicles than cars, and it doesn't seem like it when you're a student or a faculty member at Yale, but American drivers park free for 99% at the end of all of their trips. And I don't think this is sustainable. And the question is, are we going to have a hard landing, or can we figure a way to solve some of our problems? I think we can. I think we've made 2 big mistakes. One is to keep curb parking free or cheap, and to require lots of off-street parking. Here's the parking requirements in the city of New Haven, which are quite modest compared to most cities' parking requirements. They look very scientific. Somebody must know how many parking spaces a vocational trade or business school needs, or a game room as defined in section 42.2. Well, I think if you asked any of these planners where those numbers came from, none of them could explain a single one of these numbers. It looks scientific, but it isn't. And I think that the pretense to knowledge of us planners, that we can tell you how many parking spaces must be supplied before anything can be built or any business can be open, has done a lot of harm. That I think it's created a great planning disaster, which Peter Hall defined as something that costs a lot of money and has gone seriously wrong. I think that all of this parking skews all of our travel choices toward the car as the natural way to get where you want to go. It caused a lot of sprawl. It spreads buildings apart to provide room for the parking between them. A lot of the building's design is degraded by having to provide all of the parking. It makes housing more expensive because it has to include the cost of the parking. This is something that even many planners don't understand. It makes it very difficult to reuse older buildings, because if you want to open a restaurant in a former shoe store, the planners will say, well, where's the required parking? And if you don't have the required parking, you can't open the restaurant. So older buildings can't fulfill the role that they could in the city. It limits home ownership. It's very difficult to convert apartment buildings where people rent into condominiums that they can own. It damages the urban economy. I think it's done that in New Haven. And you don't have to explain the fact that it harms the environment. So some cities are solving this problem in a new way, is to get the price of parking right. Here's some of the reforms that are going on, is to charge the right price for curb parking. And by that I mean the lowest price you can charge and have 1 or 2 vacant spaces on every block. That's about an 85% occupancy rate. So the parking is well used, it's almost full, but it's readily available. Anybody driving down any street in your city can always see 1 or 2 open spaces ready to park in front of any store or restaurant so that you can go in. And cities have made this politically popular by returning the meter revenue to the neighborhoods that generate it. If you put in parking meters and charge these performance prices for parking, you'll get the revenue. And that has tended to make it very popular with the merchants and the landowners and the residents who benefit from the added public services in their neighborhoods. And once you do that, you could remove or reduce at least the minimum parking requirements, because you won't have to, nobody can say there's not enough parking, because wherever you go, you'll see plenty of parking. And I think this freedom from parking requirements will mean you can use any building for any business that's legal. Now, here's an example of what they're doing in San Francisco. They're starting this policy, and this is just an example of the prices that they expect to charge. The prices will be the lowest price they can charge at any hour and still have 1 or 2 vacant spaces on every block. So it'll be different at different times of day. It'll be different on different parts of the city. It can be higher at the second hour. Once you say that we have a principle that we understand this is the price that we want, the price that will lead to convenient parking and well-used parking, that's how we're going to set the price. We're not going to let just inertia set prices. Because they have a $20 million grant from the federal government to institute this, they have lots of money for graphic artists and who are important for anything you want to do. Here's an example of what they say is what's wrong with the city, that some blocks have all the spaces occupied and other blocks have some vacancies. So the idea is you raise the price on the top block and you lower it on the bottom block, till you get something like this. It's that simple. Some people think that charging these market prices for parking are an enormous social upheaval compared like the Reformation or Prohibition. So some enormous change in the way we live our lives. But look what a small change can achieve what is a good result. So it's very easy to legislate this. Here's the exact the ordinance language in one city in Northern California, is that the city council ceased trying to set the price for every parking space and micromanage it and say it should be $1 an hour with a limit of 2 hours. They did what a policy body should do, is they set the policy of what they want the parking supply to do, to be readily available, but well used. And they say, they establish it, they give the Transportation Authority the responsibility to move the price up and down, and the council members can just look out the window and see if they've done their job. If the spaces are half empty, the price is too high. If the spaces are all full, the price is too low. And they made this popular by returning the money to the metered zone, so that all of the affected parties, the stakeholders as we call them now, supported it. It passed the city council unanimously. They also removed the time limits on curb parking, because if the prices are going to set create vacancies, you don't need to force turnover. You shouldn't have a low price and force people out of spaces at the end of 24 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour. You should let people park as long as they're willing to pay, because the curb parking is more expensive than the off-street parking. Anybody who wants to park for a long time naturally gravitates to the off-street parking. So it's as simple as the Goldilocks principle of parking prices. We all learned this as the children. You know, a bed shouldn't be too soft or too firm, but parking prices shouldn't be too high or too low. And I think one of the problems with our existing system of having low prices is that it creates cruising for curb parking, which is driving around the block. We've all done it many times, hunting for a curb parking space. That here's a situation you could face in almost any city, that the curb parking is cheaper than off-street parking. How long would you be willing to drive around hunting for a curb space rather than pay to park off-street? We all face this problem. And because of this problem, there's an awful lot of cruising for curb parking. And here's a survey, a sort of summary of surveys. The first one was in 1927, appropriately in Detroit, finding that 20 to 30, a fifth to a third of all the cars on the street were cruising for curb parking. The most recent ones were in New York with a very clever technique of interviewing drivers who were stopped at the traffic lights and asked them if they were hunting for curb parking. And you can see that here, on one spot, 28%, and on the other was 45% of the cars were cruising for parking. That is an environmental and a transportation crime. Just think of the wasted fuel, the air pollution, creating congestion. And this is sort of what it looks like. This was a study done in Chicago in 1939, where they stationed, I'm sure they were undergraduates at a lot of corners, and they noted every car that passed every intersection and wrote down the license plate in the exact time, so they could recreate the path of travel of every car. Some people were obsessed with parking around one block, and some people were open to new experiences and would try something different. And this leads to a lot of very risky behavior. People will, they're only focused on trying to get a parking space. They ignore bicyclists, they ignore pedestrians. You see, I've seen it happen. If a car sees a vacancy on the other side of the street, they'll make a U-turn in the middle of the street, which is very dangerous. And here's some grainy footage I got in research in Westwood. I was able to interview the driver afterwards, and she says she knows that it's cheaper to park at the curb, and she does whatever it takes to get a curb parking space. Well, here is the results that we found in Westwood Village when we studied this for a year. And in this little 15-block area, there were almost 1 million miles of vehicle travel hunting for underpriced curb parking. That is, after you get to this little 15-block area, there are 1 million miles a year of traffic hunting for underpriced curb parking. So that we found that on average, there were 2 cars circling every block, and it took only 3 minutes to find the space. But there's so many people who park in a year that it all adds up. That's equal to 4 trips to the moon. In a 15-block area. It's happening all over the earth. All over the earth. Here's some people will say it's un-American to charge for curb parking, even if it does, if it is, would help the environment. But I think it's very American to charge people for what they use. Here's a picture of homeowners around the LA Coliseum during the Olympics in 1984, and it happens during every event at the Coliseum, that the residents park their own cars on the street and rent out their driveways to ticket holders. Some people think it's too difficult to do what I'm saying because they have the idea that all parking meters are like the original parking meter in 1935, is that you put your money in the slot, you turn the lever, and you hope to get back before your time runs out. That when they were invented, they were condemned as being a devilish combination of an alarm clock and a slot machine. You take your risk. But that's because most Americans don't know of all the progress that's happened everywhere else on Earth. We're now lagging behind the rest of the Earth in meter technology. Here's a parking meter of the sort that some cities have put in. Maybe New Haven has them, but this is on the UCLA campus. It's designed to look like sort of a retro parking meter. But it doesn't even accept coins. It accepts only credit cards and dollar bills. It doesn't tell you what the price is until you push a button. Any button, and then it tells you what the price is at that time. And here it is. It doesn't even tell you what the price per hour is, but of course it's $3 for the first hour and $4 for the second hour. Well, let's see, is this too high? Is this asking too much for college students to pay? Well, I say you can't tell whether the price is right until you look at the results. So I think some of you are aware that professors have a lot of spare time, and I set up my camera across from the meter and looked at 8 parking spaces controlled by this meter. You can see it, there's the meter and there's somebody paying. And I think that 1 out of 8 spaces should be vacant, around that. So let's look what happened during the hour. You can see the shadows move as the time goes by. Some people leave, some people go. Sometimes all the spaces were full, but they were quickly vacancies, sometimes 2 vacancies. Once 3 vacancies, then they filled up. So this is what happened at the end of the hour. And I think that this shows to me that that was the right price in that location at that time. And I don't see how anybody could argue, say, it's too high or it's too low. What principle would you use to say that price was wrong? It would be different at a different time, but that's what I'm arguing for. Now, I think that it's easy enough to do, and we have a choice. Our first future is just to change nothing. That I think inertia is the major driver of most curb parking policies and curb parking prices in the United States. Keep curb parking free or cheap and require ample off-street parking. And we'll live in this world with this appalling ad where people are told to buy a cheap car. You know, low-income people are told to buy a cheap car rather than ride in the bus. We'll buy lots of cars and big cars and park them for free. Here's in front of the Kodak Theater on Hollywood Boulevard. We'll need lots of roads for these cars. Here's in New Brunswick, Maryland. We'll need lots of freeways, and we'll have plenty of congestion with people on their way to their parked car, to their free parking. But we do have a possibility for a second future, which I think is far better. As to charge these performance-based prices for curb parking. We could use the revenue to repair sidewalks, to plant street trees, to put wires underground, to improve neighborhoods, to pay for public infrastructure. And then we could remove all street parking requirements. So here's the kind of world that some people say this is what he's recommending. But let me conclude by where I began in Silicon Valley. Suppose you bought into this policy, and I'm kind of an evangelist, as you could tell, that I'm trying to convince people that we're doing the wrong thing and we should do the right thing. Suppose they bought my ideas, is remove the parking requirements on this land, which is now committed to parking. You couldn't build anything else on it because it wouldn't have the required parking. That building is as big as it can be given that parking lot. Suppose you said, we've removed the parking requirements and allowed them to build on this lot. Now, I picked buildings from the University of London because they look nice. I was speaking to the Congress for New Urbanism, and they like these buildings. And they must have just been cleaned. But we wouldn't get that in California, so I just took a more pedestrian apartment buildings in Los Angeles and said, suppose you tried it. And remember, everybody in Silicon Valley complains that the traffic congestion is terrible, the cost of housing is so high, the commutes are so long, that this would address all of those problems. And remember, all of those cars, or many of those cars in that lot, are imported in California. You cannot import apartment houses. So if you were an electrician or a plumber or a drywall builder or a roofer, you'd probably think this was a great idea. If you were a worker at Cisco Systems, you could walk across the parking lot to get to work. If that worked out, if they made much more money by using that land for housing rather than for their employees, job-adjacent housing, than for free parking, they could just keep on doing it. And it could quickly become to look like a city. As you walked along that sidewalk, the curb parking wouldn't be free. But there would be street trees and there would be buildings. It could have ground floor retail. What would we do with all the parking garages that we won't need, all the Temple Street garages and the air rights garages? Well, here's one in Holland that they found a wonderful new use for it. I think the Yale students could do this too. But I think that these reforms are needed unless General Motors succeeds with this ace in the hole. It's really got a great idea. And if it succeeds, I think everybody at Yale will buy one of these cars. Here's the advanced number. I think that would be great for Yale students and faculty and staff. Well, I think planners should always conclude with a quote from Jane Jacobs, that we aren't rich because of what we have done. We are a prosperous nation because of what we've inherited. And it's up to us to make it, to continue this prosperity. And I think our current parking policies are driving us in the wrong direction. And I think that we have a president who likes to quote Abraham Lincoln. There's nobody better to quote in United States history. I think our case is new. And I think that maybe 10 years ago, it would have been unthinkable to recommend market prices for curb parking. Planners rejected markets as sort of an alien ideology. But I think now we're more willing to look at prices as a way to solve our problems. So that's about all I know, so I better stop. Thank you very much.